Kerman engineer, and we are really lucky to be able to have Dr. Ramyar Karanja with us, who is one of the doyens in the field of Zoroastrian studies. A little bit about him. I had met him initially at the university when he was in the process of submitting his doctorate and trying to get a viva as soon as possible. After that, of course, we used to meet at the institute later. But Ramyar is presently the principal of the Dadar Athornan Institute, and he has been working and researching on various aspects of Zoroastrianism and Iranian studies, having done a series of postdoctoral projects at the universities of Heidelberg, Uppsala, and Zurich. Many of us are familiar with his published writings, which reach out to all sections of the audience and all ages. All of us who read the Jamij and Jamshed newspaper are familiar with his weekly column, which is really enlightening and has educated so many of us on various aspects of Zoroastrian religion, rituals, and beliefs. So we could not have found a better person to moderate this session. I will now hand over the session to Dr. Karanja.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nawaz Modi, for that generous introduction. And good evening to Mr. Kerman Daruwalla and so many distinguished scholars who are present today, like Professor Dr. Almut Hinze, Professor Vevaina, and several other doctoral students and professors. So very good evening today for what we see is a feast of knowledge, especially for academicians. And I'm sure that Kerman will make it interesting for all of us. I have the great pleasure to introduce this young researcher, Mr. Kerman Daruwalla. And his life is not only interesting, but it is very invigorating and it is impressive. It is surprising that Kerman had his initial education in engineering and procured his master's degree from the Syracuse University in New York. It was after that he developed an interest in religion and started learning Avesta Pelvi languages at Sir J.J.'s at Madrasa, where he finished his second master's from the Mumbai University. It was at this point that he decided to delve deeper into the realms of Zoroastrian academia and joined the SOAS in London, where he got his master's in Iranian studies under Professor Dr. Almut Hinze. This was made possible on account of 3 scholarships that he received there. He has already submitted his PhD thesis on priestly training in priestly institutes, especially in Mumbai, and he is awaiting his doctoral degree anytime now. He has been very recently roped in by Parzor to set up a cultural center at TIS in Mumbai. So this is our many-faceted speaker of the evening. He has a very supportive wife in Zenobia and 2 charming young ladies, daughters, who are also present today to cheer up their father. Today's talk is expected to be an intellectual feast. It will be covering several related aspects, like the higher rituals of the Yasna and Visperad, the text used for these rituals, the training of priests in priestly institute for the higher rituals, which is his PhD thesis, and finally, academic research on rituals and ritual texts. It is natural that when you will be listening to Kerman, many questions will be cropping up in your mind. And we would request you to have those questions in the chat box so that at the end of the talk, we will take as many questions as possible. But please see to it that the questions are relating to the topic of the day. So I'll not take much time and stand before you and Mr. Kerman Daruwalla, but I'll request Kerman now, who's the person with multiple degrees across 3 continents, to present his topic for the day. Kerman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erwin Ramyar, for this very gracious introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectation that you have set. And it would be opportune to mention over here that Erwin Ramyar was my first teacher who sort of set the path for Western studies in my case. So I would like to especially thank him for that. And big thank you to Dr. Nawaz Modi for giving me this opportunity to present my work. And I also wanted to thank Yasmin, who coordinated this entire session, and also Utakshi Mistry, who helped set up this session. So I shall get right to the topic. I have a presentation which I shall try to put up on the screen, and hopefully that will work without any glitches. So is my screen visible?
Yes, very much.
Is it full screen PPT?
Yes, it is full screen.
Okay, perfect. So a very good evening to everyone who's come on a talk in India, and a very good day to people in other parts of the world. Thank you very much for making time to come and attend. The topic, as you can see, is on the Zoroastrian ceremonies of Yasna and Visperad, and I've called it endangered. And through this talk, I shall walk you on why I think these are endangered, and I basically wanted to cover 3 aspects in today's talk. Yeah, sorry. So for those who are not very familiar with Zoroastrian rituals, I would like to give an overview of what Zoroastrian rituals are like, and then sort of delve a little bit deeper into the Yasna and the Visperad rituals. Then in the sort of main part, I would like to highlight the sort of historical trend of how the performance of these rituals, in the sense, what was the ritual intensity of performance, say, about 100 years ago, and how that has changed up to the present time. And briefly at the end, I'd like to talk a bit about the academic research that has happened over the past, say, couple of decades on Zoroastrian rituals. So to start with, Zoroastrian texts are composed in a language called Avestan, and this is part of the Indo-European language family, which is very large. I mean, there are so many branches that it can't fit into one slide. And Avestan is a sister language of Vedic Sanskrit. They both share the same common Indo-Iranian heritage. So the Avestan texts, it's difficult to date exactly when they were composed, but with comparative dating with Vedic Sanskrit, it can be surmised that, or it can be guessed fairly reasonably accurately, that most of the texts were composed around 1000 BC, which is about 3000 years ago. The older parts would be older than that time, and the younger parts of the Avestan could probably be around this 1000 BC mark. So the point to note here is that most of these texts are at least about 3000 years old. And the surviving corpus during this time, during this past 3000 years, is fairly limited. I mean, unlike, say, Vedic Sanskrit, which has a very copious corpus of text, the surviving Avestan has primarily 5 main parts, which are listed here: the Yasna, the Visperad, the Videvdat, the set of Yash, which are hymns to various divinities, around 20 in number. And then there is the Khode Avesta, which is the smaller Avesta, which is a compilation of various smaller texts. And the interest for today's talk is the first 2 texts, the Yasna and the Visperad, and these are texts which are performed within a ritual context. And one thing to point out here is that we know that the text itself is at least 3000 years old, but the ceremony in which these texts are performed, the Yasna and the Visperad, are themselves described in other Avestan texts. Even within the Yasna, you find a description of what the Yasna the composition of the yasna itself, and in other texts like the Nirangestan, which is a meta ritual text. So you have a description of these rituals in other Avestan texts, and we know that Avestan texts were stopped being written, say, after 500 BCE. So we know that these ceremonies which are described have to be at least 2,500 years old. And that is very important because we're talking about the sustenance of these ceremonies, and they have survived for 2.5 millennia with relatively few changes over this time. So, with that, what I'd like to do is give you a brief background on Zoroastrian rituals. So, seen here are two different Zoroastrian rituals. One is what we call a Jashan ceremony. It's a Thanksgiving ritual, and it is classified as an outer ritual. And on the right hand side, you see two priests seated within a ritual precinct performing the yasna, which is classified as an inner ritual. And the primary the differentiation between two is of why it's an inner versus an outer is the inner is within a particularly demarcated ritual precinct, which has two sets of furrows around it, and it can only be performed. These inner rituals can only be performed in this designated place. Whereas on the left, you see a picture from the recent Jashan ceremony, which was performed a couple of Sundays ago at the Barot Caves, which is about 150 kilometers north of Mumbai. And this was where the Iran Shah Atash Beram fire was also stationed for some time. And as you can see, it is a mat is set up on this place in the mountains, and it is being performed over there, which can't be done in the case of inner rituals. Just to sort of sum it up or expand on it a little more, the outer rituals are also known in among the Parsi priests as Hoshmordi rituals. The term is not very clear, but I think it tends to mean more calculated or sort of common rituals in that sense. Whereas the inner rituals are known as the Pav Mahal. The Pav word is for a consecrated, and Mahal is a place. So it can be only performed within a consecrated place. In terms of the outer rituals are much simpler in terms of requirement of priest, of place, of time, and the inner rituals are of course much more complex. One difference, which is the last one listed in this list, is that an outer ritual can be performed by any priest who's undergone the initial initiation of Navar, whereas for the inner rituals, not only does the priest have to be fully qualified, he also needs to have undergone and performed a ritual to gain the ritual power to be able to perform these more sacred and complex rituals. And listed in these boxes are the examples of the outer and inner rituals. And one of the rituals, which is the Baj, sits somewhere in the middle because it has components of an outer ritual, but it can only be performed within a ritual precinct. So, and Edward Ramyar has a book on the Baj Dharna in which he sort of fully delves on this topic. So, having said this, I would like to go directly to the topic of the day, and what I am going to show you is a clip of of a part of the Yasna ceremony, and this is part of a film which was recorded at the Dadar Athonan Institute back in 2017 as part of the Multimedia Yasna project, which is running at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, which I am a part of. And so I'd like you to see the clip, and then we can talk a little bit about the ceremony after this. So I hope that this will play seamlessly, but if there is some problem, you can please highlight it. So here we go.
Amesha spenta dinimazdeasne, Kungavasa Bungisotrausa, Yo Aishwa Mazdeasno Aishwa, Mazdeasno Zono Sheratma, Jistiamano Yatrageta, Ashemerigan Davidudin Lishiata, Yawapaso also Trausa, yesterday Shamazes Bedinam Vizianam, Imava Jonoid Visadi from Riti Tamayatumana Jasadi, Hashem, always Tamasi, the stars still Samayat the Shai Vestai Hashem, Hashem, always Tamasi, the stars still Samayat the Shai Vestai Hashem, Hashem, always Tamasi, the stars still Samay. Yat Shai Vaistai Hashem. Hashem, always Samastiv Stastiv Samaya the Shai Vaistai Hashem.
So hopefully you were able to get a good sense of at least some bits of what the yasna ritual is. So seen here are two of our priests who perform the ritual. The person seated here is Edward Adil Besania, and the priest who was standing was our Edward Aspandia Dadachanji, who very sadly passed away just last month. And in this case, the person seated, Adil Besania, is the designated chief priest for this ritual, and Aspandiyaji Dadachanji was the assistant priest. So I'd like to just go and talk about some aspects of the yasna in the next slide. Sorry. Okay. So the yasna also is called variously as the yazashne, or in the Parsi priestly parlance is called as the jasni, and translates as worship, or in some case sacrifice is what we may call it. It is roughly a 2-hour ceremony, and it's preceded by another shorter ceremony which takes about half an hour, which is known as the paragna. The paragna is totally derived from para yagna, which means something that precedes the yagna or the yasna, and it is essentially a ceremony which is used to prepare to set up for the main yasna ceremony which follows it. And the paragna has 3-4 main sort of parts to it. The first part is to fetch the water which will be used not only as a ceremonial implement within the ritual, but also to clean the various implements that will be used. And then it is used to procure the various other implements like the date palm leaf, the milk of the goat, the pomegranate and the home twigs, the various sort of parts which make the libation which is offered, which is prepared during the ceremony. Then the third important aspect is the actual setup of the implements on the table before the yasna ceremony can actually start. So this recording, which I mentioned about which was done as part of the Muya project, also recorded the entire paragna being performed actually the paragna gets performed by the assistant priest. In this case, which was Edward Aspandiyaji Dadachanji, performed the entire paragna, and then in the ceremony, in the yasna ceremony, the roles gets reversed. He becomes the assistant priest, and the chief priest is taken over in this case by Adil Besania. The text of the yasna comprises of 72 chapters plus an introduction, which is known as a dibacho. And as we saw, the entire text for the duration of the ritual is for the entire 2-hour duration is recited without the assistance of a book. So it's completely memorized, and it's recited from rote. So just briefly, I would like to delve on the structure of the yasna text. So as I mentioned, it comprises of an introductory chapter plus 72 chapters, and these can be seen as being composed of various parts, subsections. The main sort of division can be seen as in terms of the language of the text itself, whether it is an old Avestan text which is slightly more archaic than the other parts of the Avestan. So the first 27 and the last sort of 17 chapters are in what we call Younger Avestan, and the middle section, which is from chapters 28 to 54, barring a couple of small chapters in the middle, are in what is known as Old Avestan, and these are the most these comprise of the five gathas and the Yasna Aptangati, and these are held in the highest reverence. So the gathas are attributed to Zarathustra, Prophet Zarathustra himself, and these are what we call encircled on both sides by the other younger Avestan texts. And shown here, I don't know if it's easily visible, but so even the ceremony, the first 27 chapters sort of build up. So the first two chapters of the Yasna are essentially an invitation to the various divinities, and so that is the beginning section. The next section, which we actually saw, the culmination of what we saw in the video, just seen earlier in the clip, is the Srosh drone. The drone is the sacred sacrificial bread, which is at the end of the Srosh drone, eaten by the chief priest, and hence sort of gains the power of Srosha. And then that is followed by the Home Yasht and the Fravarana and other sections. And then the last part of the first section is what we call the Homast, which involves the preparation of the Homa by pressing the Homa twigs. And then the last part, which comes after the Gathas, which also comprises of various other sections, including the hymn to Srosha, and also what is prayed commonly among the Parsis, the Atash Nyayesh and the Arid Visur Nyayesh. So that is the sort of concluding section, after which the final libation, which is prepared. At the start of the ritual, the two priests draw water, which is invigorated, and a libation is prepared out of that. And at the end of the ritual, after the 72nd chapter is completed, both the priests then go back to the well where the water was initially fetched, and pour it back to and give it back to the well itself, which is a more invigorated form of what was taken earlier. So that brings me to the significance of the Yasna ritual. So why is the Yasna ritual important in the first place? So it is essentially a ritual which is meant to maintain the order and give strength to the good creations of Aura Mazda. So it essentially is invigorating or giving strength to the good part, the good creations of Ramazda, to fight against the evil or the pollution that is affected by Angramenu. And because of this importance of the Yasna, it was a ceremony of daily performance at all the five temples until some time ago. So basically until sometime in the last century. And it is also very important because it is the foundational ceremony to build all more complex rituals. So the Yasna is sort of the most fundamental ritual, and any longer, more intricate rituals are built upon the Yasna ceremony itself by adding text to it and making it more elaborate. As I already explained, the Gathas and the Yasna Aptangati are at the core of the Yasna, and this is where they only belong, really, in the sense in no other text are the Gathas recited in any other ceremony besides the Yasna, which makes it also gives it a more exalted status. And finally, from a more sort of priestly tradition, the Yasna ritual is the one, the chief priest of the Yasna ritual, by performing the Yasna, gains what is known as the Moti Khub, or the greater ritual power. And only by getting this greater ritual power is he eligible to perform any of the other inner rituals. So even to perform just a standalone Yasna, he has to perform a Yasna to be able to get the power, the greater ritual power, in order to perform another Yasna or a Visperad or a Videvdat or any of the longer ceremonies. So the Yasna ritual becomes fundamentally important to be able to perform any other longer rituals. So having said that, I'd like to delve into what the other ritual mentioned in the topic for the day, the Visperad ceremony. So the Visperad comes from Vispe Ratavo, which translates as sort of all the Ratus, and Ratus is a term which is not easily translatable, but refers to uh, Ratu. Technically can be translated as Lord of various aspects. So there's a Lord of the day, which refers to the five gods of the day: the Havan, Rapitwin, Uzirin, the five, the Ratus of the month, the Ratus of the year, which is the six seasons, the six gambars, essentially the Mediosrem, Mediarem, the six gambars, and various other aspects like fire and water and the mountains. So the Ratus for all of this, which are all praised and invocated within the Visperat ceremony. And this ceremony, the Visperad, was specially performed. Unlike the Yasna, it was not performed during on a usual day, but it used to be specially performed during the six seasonal festivals, which are the Gambars. And also, it is part of other longer combination ceremonies. Like it is part of the Navar. Sort of the last day of the Navar, the Visperad is performed by the priestly. The Navar is the priestly initiation ceremony. And the priestly candidate has to perform the Visperad ritual ceremony on the last day of the Navar before he finally is ordained to be a Navar. It is also part of other longer ceremonies. For example, the Getik Kharid, which is again, it is a combination of a few Yasna ceremonies and then culminates with the performance of the Visperad ceremony. The Visperad text itself is divided into 24 sections. It is in some books, in the older version, it was 23 sections, the last chapter now being sort of bifurcated into two, and hence now it's divided into 24 sections. And what is important is that the Visperad ceremony the Visperad text is never prayed as a standalone or recited as a standalone text, but it is inserted and into the Yasna. As I mentioned, the Yasna is a fundamental ritual into which other texts are built in. So shown in this box, what shows up in green is these Visperad Kardes, which are the section of the Visperad. So the Visperad Karde, the first Karde, is inserted within the first chapter of the Yasna. So the Yasna ceremony is performed as it would be performed, but within that, the Visperad ceremony, the text is also inserted. And as you can see, it is all the 24 sections are inserted into some parts, especially during the main parts are during the Gathas, and it ends just after the old Avestan text and end at Yasna 54. So in terms of the Visperad ritual, it is different from the Yasna ritual in one fundamental aspect, is that what I'm showing here on this slide is taken from a manuscript, and it depicts the ritual precinct that we've just seen. So at the bottom of the screen, what they've written is the Kuan for the Zot, which means it's the seat of the Zot. And in front of it, the bigger rectangle depicts the ritual table. And on the other side, the top side in red depicts the fire stand. And shown on the sides, what is written and what has been transcribed on the sides shows the various different assistant priests. So within the Visperad ritual, we have in Visperad Kadde 3, what we have is what we call the installation of the seven assistant priests. And within the actual ritual, which is now performed only by two priests, so there's only one chief priest and one assistant priest. The assistant priest actually goes at the position of all these seven priests and recites a certain section of the Avestan. And this gives us a strong sort of pointer that maybe in the past, the rituals of the Visperad and any longer ones were performed by these set of priests. So there was not just the chief priest and the assistant priest, but there would have been many other priests who would have had special functions, like somebody would be responsible for getting the implements, and somebody would be for the water, and one for mixing the libation together, and things like that. So why this is important is that the Visperad ritual is even more rarer. I mean, even historically it was occasionally performed, but in the present day it's even it's performed very rarely essentially. So it becomes important to study the live tradition till it lasts. It becomes very important. So this sort of brings me to the second part of my talk, which is on the transmission of the text. So the Avestan texts, the ritual texts, have been transmitted in two main methods. So the texts, as we've discussed, are about 3,000 years old, and during the first almost 2 millennia, till say about 600, 600 of the common era, these were only transmitted in the oral tradition, which means it was passed on from father to son or from priest to priest orally, and these were all memorized and just passed down until sometime in the late Sasanian times when these were first written down. And shown here on the right is a manuscript of the Yasna, and so what I would like to do is sort of play this sort of short clip which shows the ritual which is being. So there are two aspects. So in the live tradition, there is obviously the recitation, which is a recited text, and then there are these ritual actions which you can see the priest performing. So in this case, I'll just play it for some time.
Yatha Umeya Taratura Sajira Chavangyo the Zamaning of Shotte Nanam Ungyos Mazai the Dream Javaya Indegapia the Red Vastari Yatha Umeya Taratura Sajira Chavangyo the Zamaning of Shotte Nanam Ungyos Mazai Shatrim Ja Orai Ayim Dregapia the Red Vastari.
So just to briefly describe it, so while the priest is reciting, he's also tying a knot on this bundle of metallic wires, which is called the barsam bundle, and this so is also written down in the manuscript. So the manuscript has what we see here is not very maybe easy to see, but in the next slide I've expanded a little bit, and there are two languages, two scripts in which this manuscript is written. There is the Avestan text, and in this case, since it's an Indian manuscript, there is the ritual directions which are written down in Gujarati language. This is old Gujarati, and what is interesting to note is that the Avestan script is written from right to left, whereas the Gujarati script is written from left to right, and hence it can't be sort of easily written next to each other. So what the tradition was that when a Gujarati text needed to be written, the manuscript was turned upside down, and then the text was written starting from the bottom going on top. So if I just highlight this text here in Gujarati, so I'll just read it out for those people who are familiar with Gujarati in this audience. So here it says, Ini Sthanak Ahanavar Padta Jyoti Barsam Nugat Lagar Ek Dhilu Rakhi Ek Dhilu Kari Padi. So what he's essentially saying is that when he reaches this point in the Avestan recitation, he has to recite, while reciting an Avnavarya, which is the Yatha Uvarya prayer, the Jyoti, the chief priest, ties a knot on the Barsam bundle and keeps one knot loose. And while doing that, he recites the text which follows this ritual instruction. And this is precisely what we see happening in the live ritual. So what is interesting to note that this manuscript is a manuscript called the B3, and it's situated at the it's kept at the Bombay University Library. Is dated from sometime early in the 16th century, so it's almost 500 years old. And this ritual direction which we find is what we find precisely what is happening in the live ritual as it's being performed in the present day. So it is interesting to note that most aspects of what we find in the manuscript have survived with fidelity in the present performance that survives. So, but sorry, I hear some background talks. So having said that, I would like to focus the rest of my talk on the living sort of performance of the ritual rather than the manuscript tradition, which can be a talk for some other day. So I have a quote here from Professor Alberto Cantera, who's also one of the experts and he's worked extensively and he's working extensively on Western on Zoroastrian rituals. And what he said here is, I'll just read it out, that the Zoroastrian long liturgy, which refers to the Yasna Visperad rituals, in reverence of the god Ahura Mazda, has been celebrated in the form in which it appears in the manuscript since the Achaemenid times, which means from about 500 BCE, and it continues to be celebrated today among the Parsis, the Zoroastrians in India. And more importantly, what he states is that throughout the centuries, this liturgy has been one of the most characteristic features of the Zoroastrian community. So in a sense, what he means to say is that the many things which have changed, but in this case, the ritual has remained to be one of the most distinguishing features of the Zoroastrian community during these past 2.5 millennia. So with that, I would just digress a little bit and talk about the rituals in Iran. So in Iran, the Yasna Visperad and even the Videbdat kind of rituals were performed until at least the 1950s and in the early part of the 1960s. But since then, the performance of these inner rituals has completely ceased due to a lack of priests having any proficiency with performing these rituals. And senior are two priests. The elder gentleman Mobed Mehraban Firozgari is the high priest of the Tehran Atashkade, and seen in the foreground is Mobed Ramin Shahzadi, a good friend. They are performing what is now their version of what you can term as a symbolic yasna, in which they recite the first about 14 to 18 chapters of the yasna, and as you can see, the setup is quite different. They are seated not within the ritual sort of space, but at a table reciting from a book, and they have the ritual implements, which are again more symbolically used rather than integrated within the actual ritual recitation. So the point to stress here is that India is the only place where the living tradition has continued up to the present day. And so just a little bit of a historical anecdote. What I'm showing here is taken from an article which was published by Edward Ramir Karanjia about what his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, Darab Shah Sidhwa, had written. And this talks about the 1920s and 30s. And Darab Shah was a priest from Udwada, from the Iran Shah Sanjana group of priests. And he writes about the 1920s, where he went around as a young priest performing rituals at many places. And he talks about these small towns like Zai Bordi, which is on the north border of Maharashtra and Gujarat, and also of Tarapur. These are two very small towns in the present day with a limited Parsi population, and even in the early part of the 20th century would have had not more than a couple of hundred Parsis at that time. And he talks about the performance of the yasna every single day. So every single morning, the priest would sit down and perform the yasna, and this is the case of these very small towns. And in a place like in Bombay and Mumbai, the third example is of an Agyari in Grant Road, which is fairly close to where I am right now. And at that time, there were 12 Mobeds at the Agyari who regularly performed the Yasna and Vandidad at that Agyari. So this is just to highlight that almost all the Agyaris, including all the smallest ones, had the Yasna as a daily performance about 100 years ago. And if you talk about the important stronghold centers, I've pointed out two over here, which is Navsari and Udwada, specifically because they are the seat of the Bagaria and the Sanjana priests, two important factions of the priesthood, and the only ones which have really survived or kept their traditions intact. On the left is a picture of the Wadi Daremer, the Wadi or the big Daremer. Daremer is the ritual precinct, which is the main headquarters of the Bagaria priest of Navsari. And on the right is the Iran Shah Atash Behram of Udwada, which is the seat of the Sanjana priest, the Mobeds. And both these places have not just one or two, but a large number of these ritual areas, which were seen in the film. So there are 21 main pavis or these ritual spaces in the Wadi Daremer, and there are a few other additional, I think, couple of them which were reserved for other smaller rituals also. And the Iran Shah Atash Behram has two main buildings, which goes by the Wadia building and the Petit one, and each of them have 8 main pavis to perform the ritual. And what I wanted to highlight was at both these places we find various anecdotes by priests who cite cases of their fathers and uncles and grandfathers during the 1950s and 60s, where they state that priests during that time would not find a single pavi free to be able to perform the yasna. And every single day, at least 2 yasna ceremonies would be performed within each pavi. So on a day at each of these places, 20 to 30 yasnas would have been simultaneously being performed. And this was a case until the 1950s and 60s, so roughly about 60 years ago. So this was a kind of ritual intensity that was prevalent until the mid 20th century. So why were so many? Where was the demand for all these ceremonies coming from? So I'd like to just sort of move back and talk about a historical reference in the Persian rivayats. These rivayats were exchanges between Zoroastrians of India, both the laity and the priesthood, with the priests of Iran, where they were asking for advice on various matters. And one of the questions here, which I list here, which is from the Riwayat of Kama Bora from the 16th century, and it was asked that what ceremonies should be performed on the important days after death, which is the first 4 days, the 10th day, the monthly anniversary, and so on, and what yasna services in particular should be offered. And then the answer is what I pasted on the next slide, and which might be slightly difficult to read, but what I'd just like to point out is what they state, that on the first, second, and third days, a yasna service should be performed in honor of Straosha. On the 4th day and the 10th day, it should be performed in honor of Ashoan or Arda Fravash, which is in honor of the Fravashis. On the 10th day, on the 30th day, the Siroza day, it should be performed in as a dedication to Siroza. Again, on the monthly anniversaries, all throughout the year, it should be again performed for Arda Fravash. And then there are other ceremonies like the Geti Kareed and the Vendidad should be performed within the first year. So in a sense, if all these were sort of put together, there would be at least 30 or more yasna ceremonies that would have to be performed in memory of the person during the first year after death. And this was really what was driving. I mean, the yasna was anyways performed as a daily ritual, but all these additional demand was mainly from these after death rituals for the people. And this was a historical reference, but if I fast forward to the 1960s, and this is an anecdote which was narrated to me by a priest, a Sanjana priest, Temtan Sidhwa, who's based in Mumbai, but he's a boywala at the Iran Shah Atash Behram. And he was citing the case of his own grandmother and what ceremonies they had performed. I think this was 1964 or 5, around that time. And what he said sort of mirrored very closely with what was mentioned in the riwayat of about 500 years ago, that on the first 3 days there were 3 yasna ceremonies performed for his grandmother and 3 more for his grandfather who had predeceased her. So this is what we call the Joda ceremonies, the ceremony of the pair, which means the yasna is not only performed for the person deceased but also for the spouse. And this would also be done for all the monthly anniversaries. And then they had the Nirangin performed, which would have another sort of 9 performances of the yasna and 1 each on each of the 6 Gamba days. And they had the ceremony called the Farvardiyan, which is the last sort of encompasses the last 10 days of the year and also goes into the next year. And the 18-day period has a yasna performance every single day. So they had about 50 yasna ceremonies performed within the first year after that for his grandmother. And this was essentially what was driving the demand for all these ceremonies. And the point to note is that these ceremonies could be, it was possible to have all these ceremonies performed because they were not terribly costly to have it done. So I don't have a slide on this, but I'll just orally mention that so if I go back to what Darab Sasidwa said, that in the second point here, he said that every day rupees 2 to 3 could be received for performing the Baj and Yajashne. So roughly 2 rupees was what was the expense to commission a Yasna ceremony, and both the priests would technically probably earn 1 rupee each from the ceremony, and this was in the 1920s and 30s. And if I would like to quote an example of one of the priests, one of the priest who is now the Mirjiran, Edward Keki Rauji, who told me about the cost of a Yasna ceremony during the 1970s, which is about 50 years after the case of Edward Sidwa, which we just saw. So so Dastur Rauji mentioned that during the 1970s, when he was a priest in Navsari, the Yasna ceremony costed 5 rupees, and he and the assistant priest would each earn 2.5 rupees for the entire Yasna performance of 2 hours. So from the 1920s, when it was 1 rupee, it had barely changed over that 50-60 year period. And that was the prime driver why most priests, I think the economical factor was what drove away most priests away from continuing in the priestly profession. So if I fast forward to the present day, this shows what the present scenario of ritual, the inner ritualing performing priest is. So what I've shown here is for these various locations: Mumbai, Navsari, Surat, and Udwada. There are these locations or places, the fire temples with where the ceremonies, the inner ceremonies, are still being performed, and the count of priests at each of these locations who perform the ceremony. So I have listed down in the first box, like the Anjuman Atash Beram of Mumbai, the Wadiya Ji, the Banajilim Ji Agyari, and the Rustam from Agyari at Dadar. All of these roughly had around 4 to 5 priests who had performed the Yasna during at least the preceding 5 years from the time of this study, which was about 3-4 years ago. So and then there are a bunch of other Agyaris and Atash Berams which had only about 1 or 2 priests who could perform these rituals. Navsari, where we saw that it was Navsari and both Udwada, where we saw during the 1950s there was this huge supply of priests. Now in the present day have only 2 and 4 priests respectively. And the place which has the maximum number of ritual performing priests at a single location is the D.N. Modi Atash Beram of Surat, which in the present day has the most number of inner rituals being performed at a single location. So all said, there are about total 50 priests, and this number has even reduced further over the last 3-4 years, who are able and who have performed a Yasna over the last say 10-year period. And this drastic reduction from the earlier times is due to a bunch of factors, and I'd like to just briefly talk about why this number would have reduced. So one of the important points to understand, and as I've already highlighted earlier, is that to perform a Yasna proficiently, it needs to be completely memorized. So why do we need to memorize it? The first important point is that because throughout the ritual, the priest needs to perform various ritual actions, and he needs both his hands and his gaze on the ritual objects to be able to perform it simultaneously. It is not possible to read from a book and to be able to perform the ritual. So that is the first point why it becomes important. The memorization of the entire text becomes important. Also, time to time, the priest needs to gaze at the fire at the ritual table when he's reciting. So it is not possible to look away from the ritual table even when he's not performing a ritual action. And a third important point is the book itself is an object which can't be purified, which can't be made a purified object within the ritual. Even if it's brought within the ritual precinct, every time it is touched by the priest, he needs to purify his hands again 3 times ritually before he can resume the ritual. So if he had to turn a page every time while reading a book, it would be sort of impossible or not practical to perform the ritual in the sort of allocated time. So hence, to be able to perform the yasna, only priests who have completely memorized it can do the ritual actually. So this brings me to who are the priests. So if I just go back to the 50 priests who have performed the yasna in the past say decade, 44 out of these priests. So there are only 6 priests who have trained outside of the 2 priestly training schools. An overwhelming majority, 90% of the priests hail from one of the only 2 priestly training institutions, which is the Dadar Athonan Institute and the MF Kama Athonan Institute, both of which are in Mumbai and both of which were founded just about a century ago. The Dadar Institute already celebrated its centenary a couple of years ago, and the Kama Athonan will do it in 2023 when it complete 100 years. And the current state is that the Dadar school has currently 23 enrolled students, and whereas the Andheri Athonan shown on the right hand side unfortunately has had no students for the past 3-4 year period now. And I'd like to delve into this statistic a little bit in detail. So shown here is a graph of the enrollment. So the total number of students who are enrolled in each decade at both this institution. The DAI is the Dadar Athonan Institute and the MFCI is the MF Kama Athonan Institute of Andheri. So the blue indicates the figures for the Dadar Athonan Institute and the orange is for the Kama. And what we can see is that while the Dadar Institute had a fairly stable intake for the first good 7 decades till the 1980s. So they had about 60, more or less 60 students during each decade. Not during each decade, but at any point of time during the year, during the decade on average. And that was because they had a smaller premises and they could house only about that many students at that time. Whereas the MF Kama Athonan, as you saw in this image, is a humongous building and could house a lot more. And during the peak of the students enrolled, they had about 130 odd students during a single time during the 1930s and 40s. However, since then the numbers have fallen, and drastically after the 1970s, which is when they discontinued secular academic education for a number of years. So, sorry, somebody's unmuted, I think. So what we can see is after the 1970s, the MF Kama Athonan, the numbers were slightly stable during the 80s and 90s at around 20 to 30 students, but then since then have drastically fallen. And as I've said already mentioned, after the 2010s, there were a couple of students, and then since the last 5 years, there have been no new students who have enrolled as of now. The case of Dadar has reduced since the 1980s because just generally less students are coming to enroll as for the priestly curriculum. However, this has remained constant almost during this past decade at around 20. So the numbers have remained around 20 for the last at least 6-7 years now. So what I'm showing here is a picture which which was taken during the time in 2017, which shows the staff and the students of the Andheri Athonan. At the center is the principal Erwad Ramyar, and flanked on both sides are the two Bhantar or the prayer recitation teachers, Kersi Karanjia and Sarosh Beram Kamdin. And this was the year when we did our entire Yasna recording, and where I did most of my field work to study how these students undergo the entire curriculum. I would like to just point out, so this shown here is the 7-year curriculum at the Dadar Athonan Institute, and this is divided. So this is basically a guidance curriculum. It doesn't follow your typical school curriculum where only this is covered during the first year and then the second year, but this depends individually on each student. So some student can complete this entire curriculum within say 4 to 5 years, whereas a slower candidate could take technically 8 to 10 years to complete it. So this curriculum runs in parallel to the secular schooling curriculum, which the student would undergo at an external school. Um, the typical student is enrolled at the ages of 6 to 8 years, which means he would start at the first to second or third standard of school, and then go through this priestly curriculum in parallel to his schooling. So what is highlighted here in bold is what I'm showing is how much time is dedicated to the Yasna study. So after the first year, when the Gujarati script is learned and the basic prayers are learned, from the second year, the student learns a few of the Yash, and he starts his Yasna memorization in the second year. And that continues all the way through the third, fourth, and fifth years, almost to the end of the fifth year. So the student takes about 3.5 years on average, to complete this entire curriculum, and before he can undergo the first initiation of Navar, and then subsequently he has other texts to memorize before he can complete his second and sort of final initiation of Martab. So again, what I wanted to highlight is out of the 7 years, 3.5 to 4 years are just dedicated to the memorization of the Yasna text, and this is the core of the entire study. So the undergoing this training in Parsi parlance is also the priests refer to the priestly training as learning the botteri. The botter is a word which in Gujarati means 72, and it refers to learning the 72 has of the Yasna by heart. So at the core, training to become a full-fledged priest, what we would call a pakka yos datregar mobed, is essentially memorizing the entire Yasna text, which is very difficult to duplicate in a setup outside the Athornan Institute. So this was similar to what was practiced at the Andheri Athornan, and this in terms of hours. So just to give you a reference, a student at the Athornan spends about 2 hours each day learning, memorizing, and revising the prayer curriculum. So over a week, he roughly spends about 15 hours. He spends more time on the weekend than on the weekdays to memorize, which translates to roughly about 750 hours in a year. And over the 6 year period, 6 to 7 year period, this translates to about 5,000 years of studying the curriculum. This is a sheerly humongous amount of time that is simply not possible to duplicate outside of this setup. I mean, in a disciplined way. There are obviously some examples, of people who have learned outside in the present day, but very few and far. And which is what I would like to sum up in this slide, that the Yasna Visperad have had an unbroken tradition for at least the last 2,500 years, and performing it with proficiency requires that the entire text is memorized. But the sheer amount of time that is required is not possible to duplicate outside of the Athornan institutes. And the enrollments at these institutes itself has dropped now presently to about 1 or 2 each year. The Dadar Athornan over the last, so this year it had, I think, 4 new enrollments, but there was none last year. So on average, there are about 2 each year. But the problem is there are a lot many more priests who are retiring and who have stopped performing rituals, which are not being replenished by the younger ones. And another issue is that most of the pass outs of the Athornan Institute themselves don't end up going to perform as a ritual priest, as an inner ritual performing priest. So even there is a smaller subset of all the students passing out who will actually end up performing these rituals. So in essence, what has survived for more than 2 millennia seems to be endangered because there are so less qualified priests to continue this in the coming decades. And hence the title of this talk is, this is an endangered heritage which needs to be both documented as well as an incentive for more priests to perform these rituals has to be built in. I mean, one is obviously the financial incentive, but there is a whole ecosystem around it that needs to be built to address it. So that sort of brings me to the end of my main part of my talk. In this concluding section, I'd like to just quickly spend some time on the academic sort of advances or what has been happening in the important projects on Zoroastrian rituals around the world. So before I start, I'd like to quote Michael Stossberg, professor who also incidentally was my PhD examiner very recently, and he has said in his study of the of this ritual of the study on Zoroastrian rituals that these rituals constitute an interrelated network that is constructed upon various degrees of complexity. So it's not as simple as we've highlighted it earlier into say outer and inner rituals, but it is a gradient of complexity. So the rituals like the Visperad, Vandidad, and Nirangin, they are ever more complex combinations of rituals being put together. And the yasna itself, which we consider to be more fundamental, is itself constructed of these several units which can individually be performed as separate rituals. So to show that visually, um, our view of the rituals which from the past 100 years has been that more rigid in terms of that this is an inner ritual and this is an outer ritual is more it can be viewed as it has been pointed out now that as a gradient, that there are these basic rituals which are probably derived from the ceremony of a yasna or Visperad, and then all more increasingly complex rituals are built. So for example, as we saw, the Visperad is built upon the yasna. Then there are what we call the intercalation ceremonies like the Videvdad and the Vishtas Pyast, which were inserted into the Yasna Visperad text or ritual and then performed within it. So the Videvdad text is prayed within the Yasna Visperad ritual when it is performed as an all-night ritual. And several performances of these individual rituals form these very longer, intricate combination ceremonies. Like, for example, an hour ceremony has four days of yasna performance. I mean, 3 days of yasna dedicated to a different entity. Then the last day is a Visperat performance. The Nirangdin is one of the most exalted ceremonies that is still presently performed among the Parsis, and it has a combination of 9 yasna ceremonies performed, and it culminates with the Videvdat performance on the last day. And among the most complex and longest existing ceremonies, which is still extant and has been performed once earlier this year in Surat, is what is the Hamayasht, and this comes in two variants: the smaller, the Nani Hamayasht, and the Moti or the larger Hamayasht. The smaller one comprises of 144 yasna ceremonies and 12 Videvdat ceremonies. One set of 12 yasna and one Videvdat is dedicated to one entity, and 12 such entities are invoked during this period of time, which takes roughly a month to month and a half by a set of more than set of say 2 or 3 pairs of priests. So about 4 to 6 priests would perform this ritual to complete it within a reasonable amount of time. And the Moti Hamayash, the large Hamayash, which was performed once, I think, a couple of decades ago, is something which also requires, in addition to the 144 yasna, 144 performance of the Videvdat, which is an extremely extensive requirement and requires a lot more because not all of the yasna performing priests do perform the Videvdat ceremony. So it is a much more complex and intricate ritual, which in the present day is very difficult to duplicate as of now with the amount of priests available. So having said that, this is the new sort of paradigm change or the way to visualize these Zoroastrian rituals. And I'd like to briefly spend about 5-10 minutes to talk about specific projects which are running. The first one I would like to talk about is the multimedia Yasna, which I am a part of. And that project is been running from the past 5 years now, and will be ending in the next year. And it is directed by Professor Almut Hinze, who has also joined us for this talk today. And it comprises of a team of 8 postdoctoral researchers and PhD students. And I was the first PhD student for in this program, which started in 2016. And we have a few more people in this cohort who have joined us on the talk today. And the main aim of this was to not only was obviously the study of the Yasna text, but not only as a text which is attested in the manuscript, but as a living tradition. So for the first time, it studied the actual performance of how the Yasna ceremony is performed in the present day among the Parsi priests. And that was the reason for the full-length recording of the Yasna, which in our case spanned almost close to 5 hours, because it was preceded by the Paragna, and then various sort of smaller aspect of the Yasna were again shot. And this footage is what will be one of the main outputs of the Muya project, which will be a complete Yasna film, which will be open for access, and it will be an interactive film, which I'll just show you more details on it on a coming slide. The second important output of the Muya project is the actual documentation of the priestly training, which was what I was responsible for the documentation, and which was the main core of my thesis, which was an ethnographic study of the priestly training at the Dadar Athonan Institute, which is the only functional school anywhere in the world. The third important aspect of the project is developing the actual tools which allow you to edit a text. So a manuscript needs to be duplicated and transcribed. So what was developed is an online transcription editor to be able to transcribe the entire manuscript, and then that can be further collated and compared with other manuscripts. So these tools were developed as part of this project and will be able to be used in all further projects in the future. And the final, fourth, and most important aspect of the Muya project is the actual individual text editions of different parts of the Yasna, which each of the collaborators is responsible for. So most of the parts of the Yasna will be covered and will be edited. So there'll be a new translation along with the entire apparatus which accompanies the translation of the textual edition of any Avestan text. So I'd like to briefly show you what the output of the interactive Yasna film will be like, and I want to thank my colleague Celine Redard for sharing this clip. So I'll just play it. Shown here is the same the clip of the Yasna ceremony, but the user here will have an option to pause the ceremony and view the various parts of the ceremony and get more details of what the ritual item is, and also to get a live translation, so transcription of the Avestan text and the translation at the bottom, and also a description of what the ritual performance is in the film, as well as how it is described in the manuscripts. So I'll just play the short clip, which will give you a better idea. So in this case, the user has paused it, and now he's clicked. It was clicked first on the fire was, which described the fire was, and then on the ritual table, which we find on the right hand side window, that it describes what a ritual table is and what is its function and where is it used and other detailed information. So this will give a completely new dimension, both for anyone who's just interested in Zoroastrian rituals, as well as to scholars and experts of the ritual who are working on Zoroastrian rituals, to view it in a completely different perspective. And this film should be completed anytime next year, and will be available on an open access platform for anyone on the internet. So then, okay, I'd like to talk Okay, well, one more important initiative which was started off initially at the University of Salamanca and then continued on to Berlin by Professor Alberto Cantera and his team was the Western Digital Archive, and this is it's an initiative which basically was the digitization, which means the photographing of each page of all the manuscripts of various rituals, and then the annotation of all of this. So shown here is an image of one of the manuscript, which is in the city of Kerman in Iran, and this shows a page from the a folio, which is the start of the Gathas. It is the Yasna 28, and so what and on the left hand panel we see all the manuscripts which are available to view. So if I wanted to say look at one section, one stanza from the Yasna, in this case if I was looking at 28:1, then I could view it just by clicking on the manuscript on the left hand side and see how it is attested in each of these manuscripts just by sitting at my computer. And this has made it tremendously easy for scholars like who are working and people like me who are working on the transcription and translation of the text to be able to work on say 50-60 manuscripts without having to actually travel around the world and visit each of these libraries at any place. So this is one initiative which actually has helped put in motion most other projects, and this has also led to the to a more longer term project, again driven by Professor Alberto Cantera at the Freie University in Berlin, which the aim of which is to edit most of the ritual texts of the Avestan, and that has started off, and there are many experts who are working on it, including one of the priests who was seen in an image of the Iranian rituals, Ramin Shahzadeh. Even he's part of, and he will be studying the Iranian actual ritual performance as part of this project at Berlin. So in the very final end, I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the Yasna Visperad book, which I and my colleague Celine Redard published, and it was published recently in March of 2021 of this year. And this is essentially a transcription and translation from Gujarati to English of the Yasna Ba Nirang book by T.D. Anklesharya. This was written in 1888, and T.D. Anklesharya's Yasna Ba Nirang is the most important book on the Indian Yasna ceremony. It basically describes, it has the Avestan text taken from the editions of Vesnagard and Gellner, but the Gujarati ritual direction, which describes how the ritual is to be performed, is taken from the older print editions and the manuscripts which are no longer extant and no longer easily available. And since the time of this publication in the late 19th century, this has been the standard handbook to learn the rituals. So, for example, since the time of their inception, at both the Dadar and the Athonan, at Dadar and the MF Kama Athonan, this T.D. Anklesharya has been the standard textbook to teach the ritual, and even priests who are learning outside would refer to this as the standard textbook. But in terms of more scholarly research, since most experts working on Zoroastrian rituals are not very familiar with Gujarati, the Indian tradition has traditionally not been given as much focus as the Iranian tradition, in which the languages of Persian and Middle Persian ritual directions are more familiar with most experts. And hence this book becomes very important because the first ever edition to open up the Gujarati ritual tradition of the Indian Zoroastrian community for more wider research. And we hope, I and my colleagues Celine would hope that this would lead to a lot more work being done, not just on the present day Gujarati rituals, but also the ones which are cited in the manuscripts, which remains a completely sort of closed book to most scholars on Zoroastrian rituals. And to end this talk, I put up a slide on some of the uncommon terms in Gujarati, which I struggled with during the initial part of the book, initial part of working with the book. And for the people who are familiar in the audience, I have put up the Gujarati and its transcription, and I would like you all to take a look at these terms and see how many of these 10 terms you are familiar with. And maybe after a few questions, I will put up the translation of these terms, and you can check how you did among out of 10 marks on this. So with this, I'd like to conclude my talk of the day. I hope that I was able to shine some light on some aspect of Zoroastrian rituals which you were not already aware of. And I would be happy to take questions related to this topic. So, Ramyar, I think, how shall we do it? Shall I stop the screen sharing or?
Do you need this slide just now?
No, not right now, but maybe before we end, I'd like to just put up a slide with the well, so, or if you can leave it on, I can leave it on. How does this work?
No, I think we should stop this
Okay.
sharing as of now, and as and when required, you can do it again.
Okay, I'll do that. So I've stopped sharing and we're back to the, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Kerman, for that very impressive and interesting presentation. I, for one, thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm sure that everybody who was present over here, almost 70 people who are present in this online presentation have enjoyed it. I'm sure you have worked very hard. I have seen you working at my institute for hours and weeks and days and months. And it is showing in this presentation itself, and I'm sure it will show in your thesis also. What you have tried to do is bridge the East and West together, the world of academia and the world of the practical priestly performance. This is something which is not often done. So this is one thing that you have done in your presentation, bring together the East and the West, the academic and the popular, and also you have delved into the past. You have shown the present, and hopefully you have also focused on the future. So all in all, it has been a very interesting presentation, not only interesting, but very informative. And thank you very much for that. And we are grateful to Muya for taking up this wonderful project, which is throwing more and more light, not only on rituals, but on priests and priestly training. So there have already been a few comments and questions. So Kerman, are you ready for them now?
Yes, surely. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So the first one is from Dr. Karishma Kuka, who just appreciates you. Thank you very much for organizing this talk, which will help share the education of these important rituals. We are most grateful with respect. Then somebody has wished you hi. And then we come to the question by Dr. Karishma.
Yeah.
Please, could you give details of the events when the Visperad is prayed and the importance in each case?
Right. So I think, yeah, I will try to answer it, and Ramya, if you can add on to it if I've missed out something. So the Visperad, as I said, is dedicated to all the ratus, and one of the important ratus are the ratus, the seasonal ratus or the ratus of the year, which is the what we celebrate as the 6 gambars. And it has been a traditional practice that these gambars were celebrated with great pomp, and the religious part of these ceremonies was a performance of the Visperad ritual, which was the case until I guess a few decades ago, that it was also performed religiously in India, but somehow now has not survived up to the present day. So when I ask priests on whether they do perform the standalone Visperad ritual, the common answer is that they have never done it. They've almost never done it. The only exception I talk about Mumbai right now. In Mumbai is one of the Agyaris, Banaji Limji, which still seems to be performing the standalone Visperad whenever somebody wants to commission it. However, it is performed as part of the other combination longer ceremonies. So the Navar requires a Visperad ceremony to be performed on the last day, which it is still performed in most cases. And also during the rituals like the Getting Kharid. The Getting Kharid is a similar ritual like the Nirandin, but so it has the 3 days of the Yasna performances, and on the last day there is a Visperad ritual that needs to be performed. And that is where that is one more use of the Visperad ritual itself. And on top of mine, I'm not able to think of any other specific times when the Visperad is done. And on the Gambars, just to add that in Iran, the celebration of the Gambar is still done up to the present day, much more than I think what the Parsis have perhaps retained. But unfortunately, that doesn't involve or include the performance of the Visperad ritual. So,
Thank you, Kerman. That
yeah.
was quite a comprehensive answer from you.
Yeah.
Another question is from Rashida Todiwala. When and why were the balsam twigs replaced by metallic ones?
Yeah. Again, I don't have a in-depth study on this, but I think it was just a case of being more practical. So, if we study the ritual handbook, it gives you both the method to procure a balsam from plants, and as well as to procure a balsam which are metallic balsams. The metallic ones are usually they pre-exist; they don't need to be plucked from trees. So, in the case of a plant balsam, they could be procured from either a pomegranate tree or what is called a chini nujor, which was one of the things which I put up in the Gujarati screen. Which is the chini jar is the gauze or the tamarisk tree. And just practically, because the yasna requires 35 of these twigs, 23 of these twigs, and the longer ones like the Videvdat require 35 of these twigs, and the longer ceremonies even required even more of these twigs in a bundle. It would just be less practical to do it every time that they wanted to perform a ritual, and hence once you had the ability to have a thin metallic wire, that was what replaced it. And what is interesting to note is that just the wire was did not just replace the plant twigs, but also the dedication which was recited during the paragna has also changed from one which is dedicated to the Orvar, or so that is Amadadam Shasmanai. In the case of a plant, when you're procuring the plant balsam, to the one which is for Shatravarya in the case of a metallic balsam, because Shatravarya or Sherevar is what is resides over the metallic kingdom. So I think I've given you a perspective on it, but if somebody has more details, then I mean they can probably add to it.
Thank you, Kerman. Okay. Another question from the same lady is, my second question is, if only one of the three Vandidat is done, what can be done regarding the other two with regards to the Varsi prayers? I'm not very clear myself on what she's trying to ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If only one of the three Vandidat is done, I think she means in the first 3 days. What can be done regarding the other two with regards to Varsi prayers, which means I think she means till the Varsi prayers.
Right. So I think it's a matter of, I think this comes from the slide where at some point of time, 3 Videvdat prayers would have been performed during the first 3 days after death, which is, I mean, it's just difficult to imagine in the present day to be able to do that but this was done probably less than 100 years ago, because there were a huge supply of priests who already had the higher ritual power, who had already performed the yasna and were readily available for these sort of rituals. So say in the 1930s and 40s in Navsari or in Udvada or even Surat, you would have had priests who would be able to perform 3 Videvdat ceremonies on the first 3 days after death. What happens in the case if you're not able to do it? I mean, technically that is what happens now, that having a Videvdat even during the first 3-4 days is difficult, and hence the common practice is that you do it at least once during the first year, if possible, perhaps on a monthly anniversary or on any other day. And in this case, again, I mean, it's a matter of substitution, but like I said, it's considered efficacious to have it performed at least once within the first year.
Thank you, Kerman. I think that qualifies you for the title of a lay mobbed, perhaps.
I'm honored.
Yeah. So we go on to the remark of Jaru and Karishma, and once again, deepest respect to our Morbid Sahibs and Ervat Sahibs and their families for all the dedication in performing and in teaching these rituals and preserving the traditions. So thank you. Then compliment to you, excellent talk.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank Firoza and Khojaste specifically because during the initial years of my research, I met them. And one of the things that Khojaste in particular pointed out was that there are many scholars who will work on the Avestan and the Palvi and things, but there's really no one who's doing anything much on the Gujarati bit. I mean, there's Dasuji Kotwal who's like the scholar, and then there's Ramyar and Parvez Baja, but really there's no one who's doing anything on the Gujarati. And that is something that has stayed in my mind since the time I've been I was doing my PhD, and that's the reason which sort of also contributed in some bit to my working on the Gujarati book and the Gujarati translations of the ritual direction. So thank you, Firoza and Khojaste, for that.
So then, Kerman, there are compliments to you from Zareen Malwa, Zarir Bandara, Mayor Mystery, and gratitude from others. Let's see whether there are any questions. Sarah is also there, very distinguished professor. Sarah Stewart says, thank you, Kerman, for an excellent and very informative presentation. I hope we can access the recording afterwards. It would be so useful for teaching purposes. So I'm sure the organizers, the KR Kama Oriental Institute, which has organized this wonderful talk, will look into this.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Sarah, who was also part of my PhD advisory panel, for her inputs that I've got over the years. Thank you very much for that. Yeah.
Then Professor Aban Setna is here. She compliments you. Thank you for very interesting and detailed lecture. In view of drop in voice, who aspired to be priests? Can't we allow boys of non-Athornan families to train as priests? And what is your take on Bedin Pasban?
Yes.
Only if you wish to answer this question, because this is not strictly in the purview, but if you want to take it up, Kerman.
Right. I will. Yeah, I can briefly it's a subjective question. I think, can't we allow boys of non-Athornan families to train as priests? Is something, we can look at historical precedents for it. I think it comes down to really whether there are enough priests available to meet the demands of the community. I think as long as the priest can meet the demand, you're not forced to look at other sources. I think that is what I would like to say. On the Bedin Pasban, I think they're doing a very great job. I underwent the Bedin Pasban program myself. I have not practiced as a Bedin Pasban myself, but it is definitely an important program because there are many locations where there are no priests who are willing to serve, and a Bedin Pasban can definitely do justice, as it has been the case in Kanpur and bunch of other places, where they not only have taken care of the boy and the fire, tending to the fire, but also help the community perform the ritual requirements of which are mainly outer ritual requirements, but including things like the Gesarna, which is a death ritual, which is very important, and without a priest being there would probably have not been performed at all. So I think it's a very important program in its own right.
And once again, a comment from Malcolm Daruwalla. Thank you, Kerman, for that very informed talk. Not everyone undertakes such a dedicated endeavor, such as your PhD at SOAS, as you have. I wish you and all those who have supported you all the very best. And availability of this recording will be most appreciated. A big thank you to the KR Kama Oriental Institute for arranging this Zoom session.
Right. So is this Malcolm, not Malcolm Debu, right?
No, this is Malcolm Daruwalla.
Okay, sorry, I'm just seeing the name, so I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Malcolm, for your...
Then, in view of your engineering background, do you have any insights into the electromagnetic aspects of the rituals, including the pavis, etc.? With gratitude to you and your teachers for all your research, Karishma.
That's a very interesting question, but it's technically, my engineering background was, again, it was in telecommunication, which deals with sort of waves, but I would honestly not be in a position to comment anything on the actual that aspect of rituals. I'm not qualified, and I would not like to state something without any sort of authority on this. So unfortunately, I don't know if somebody, if Ramya, you or somebody else can take it. It would be nice to do it.
Okay, thank you, Kerman. Then Rashida, thanks you for answering the two questions. And I think we are at the end of the questions that we had in the chat box. So with this,
Yeah, before we end, I don't know if anybody is still attempted. I would just like to quickly share the screen and just show up the, if somebody still hung on to the, so if I can do that for just a couple of minutes, share screen, let's see.
yeah,
Yeah, and where is my PowerPoint? So this was what I put up. Can you see it? And these are terms which are not very commonly used, not at least in Gujarati. So like Abdu Padwu, Ugman Disha, Alaidi Pavi, Pragat Padwe, Sapati and things. So I have put the answers on the next slide. So Abdu Padwu is to put something upside down. This is, I think among the priests this would be fairly well known, but not among the rest of the community, at least not among, I think, the younger generation. Uguman Disha is something which was not very commonly used, not commonly used, refers to the direction of rising of the sun, the east. Allahedi is another term which was very new to me itself, and this means something that is separate or not connected. So Alaidi Pavi is a ritual area which is not connected. Pragat or Pargat Padvu is to read something aloud. Pani is sapati. Pani is water, and sapati refers to the surface of water. This is another term which is not commonly used as of now. Then there are others like Tai, Sudha. Sudha is means that together with, along with something. The next one was Chotarafti. So Chotaraf is sort of all sides, all four sides from that side. The Chininu Jad is it reference to the plant barsam. The plant barsam is procured from either the chini or the pomegranate tree, and it refers to the tamarisk or the gauze tree. The last couple of terms was the Sanmukh. Sanmukh Jyotam is to look from front or to face something. And the last one was the Atas Napatra or Atas Nu Patru. The Patru refers to the plate of the fire, the receptacle of the fire. So this was just to just as an exercise for anybody who's interested. So thank you very much. With that, I will end my screen sharing and thank everyone who's been presently waited for and gone through this hearing.
thank you very much, Kerman. Dr. Nawaz Modi,
Yes, Aman. I just
would
like
you
to
like to take over for the vote of thanks?
see. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, I've really enjoyed the session very much, having very little knowledge about this. And I thank you, Kerman, for taking so much trouble and presenting in such a detailed fashion and educating. I think what was a very good audience that you had today. In fact, it is rare to find someone who has worked on this area and find them making a presentation. So I'm very grateful to you for introducing this topic to most of us who are quite ignorant about this whole thing. We also are in the process of putting up this recording on our website. We hope that we will be able to do it soon. And I'm really grateful to Dr. Ramyar Karanja for moderating this session so ably. I think no one could have done it in your fashion because you know so much about this topic and area. And I am greatly grateful to all of you who have taken the trouble to be with us for this particular session. And join us for our future programs, which you will be announcing very soon for the month of December. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, and
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
हाँ खा लिया
Okay, so
Bye.
yeah. Okay, I think I am one of the hosts, so I could end the recording. So thank you very much, at least. I see